One of the key books of the women's movement in the 1960s, much to the chagrin of its author, Doris Lessing. More on that in a little bit. Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook is the next book on my list of the unofficial top 125 books that have ever been written. And I am so happy to report, after the debacle that was Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer, that this was just a fantastic experience. I was thrilled to read this book. It's the story of Anna Wolfe, a struggling writer living in London in the late 50s, I think. To this point, she's been able to support herself because of the sales of the one novel that she's published, a bestseller called Frontiers of War. It's based on Anna's youth in colonial Africa during World War II, and it centers around this group of young, white idealists and their experience in the Communist Party. But when the story in The Golden Notebook starts, Anna is unfortunately experiencing the worst writer's block of her life. She literally can't write her next novel because, as she admits, everything that she's writing isn't true. So in an attempt to kind of shake herself from this blockage, she decides that she's going to write 4 distinct notebooks to kind of explore the different sides of herself. In the black notebook, she reviews the African experience of her youth. In the red one, she talks about her political life and kind of her disillusionment with the communist movement. In the yellow book, she kind of fictionalizes stories from her own life. And the blue notebook kind of acts as a personal diary. Ultimately, Anna's notebooks serve as a kind of self-therapy. And in addition to this, there is a 5th narrative, which is a short novel called Free Women, which is split into 5 parts and kind of interspersed between the notebooks as the story goes along. Now that I'm talking about it out loud, the story actually sounds, or at least the structure sounds, hopelessly complicated, but I promise it's actually not. It sounds a lot more convoluted than it really is. At the end of the blue notebook, which again chronicles kind of her daily life, Anna falls in love with an American, and the resulting, we'll call it chaos of that relationship, finally kind of sets her free from her writer's block, and she can finally merge each of these notebooks into one central story, which she calls The Golden Notebook. In Anna's words, it finally allowed her to put all of herself in one book. So this theme of like breakdown or compartmentalization was always intended to be the major theme of Lessing's book. It was never supposed to be kind of this weapon that was used in the sex war, as it soon became. As we've seen time and time again, once a book is published, it's not really the author's work to define anymore. The audience does that, and they very clearly saw something in The Golden Notebook that Lessing didn't, or at least didn't intend to be as large an issue as it eventually became. Basically, there are some really important feminist commentaries in The Golden Notebook, whether Doris Lessing intended to put them there or not. And they have become important to many, many, many people. So our central character, Anna, really has only one close friend, Molly. Like Anna, Molly's a divorced mother, and she's also a disillusioned communist, a minor actress. Molly supports herself and her son on what can only be described as a modest income. Molly and Anna are, they're certainly very aware of the financial difficulties and even the social difficulties that come from a woman in this time choosing a type of freedom over, we'll say, a type of security. But what's important is that they never once feel sorry for themselves, and they never compromise in order to gain that security. Lessing's treatment of Anna and Molly just screams of Lessing's own upbringing and life in war-torn Africa. She had seen firsthand just how unforgiving the world can be, how horrible and disgusting and cruel. So she didn't really assign her leads as heroines, per se. I don't really think that she saw them that way. They're simply standing up for what they want and then just having the courage of their convictions to live their life that way. These women remain interested in men, at least in the abstract sense, even while criticizing man's worst natures, because those are pretty obvious. Both women remain sexually active and even kind of welcome affairs whenever they make sense, but they both admit that men somehow always seem to fall flat for them. As Lessing puts it, these men don't come through, but that doesn't necessarily change their resolve. And while Molly eventually settles into a marriage of convenience, Anna continues to live independently. To the end, she never gives in to compromise. But in a bit of irony, she eventually becomes a marriage counselor because she thinks that she's very good at other people's marriages. But Anna's lack of compromise, to me, was just, that's the central theme of the novel. And that's ultimately why Lessing has been hailed as a feminist icon despite her misgivings about being one. Anna's lack of compromise with socialism, with her marriage, with her career as a novelist, that's the consistent thread that runs through this otherwise meandering tapestry that is the Golden Notebook. With great patience, because this is a fairly long book, Lessing kind of weaves that theme like quite literally through different colors. What I loved about Anna is that she demands that her men complete her. She knows that men can provide different things for women because we are quite different after all, but in addition to kind of strength and assurance, she also wants intimacy and compassion and closeness from these people. As a man, reading the Golden Notebook was often wonderful because I got this distinct feeling that Lessing was presenting women as they naturally were and not through like the lens that I get to see them through every day. Because try as I might, I will always see the world through the lens of a man, and any woman who is talking with me or interacting around me is doing so knowing that a man is watching them, and that changes behavior. Anna and Molly, even 60 years later now, since the book has been published, they felt fresh to me. They felt real for the most part. It's like I was given this peek into how intelligent, self-possessed women talk to each other when they're not being observed by men. I know a few of these women in my own life, but like I said, I never get to see them outside of me without my influence somehow. Even though I think that Lessing is undermining her own feminist importance, I do love her just outright refusal, maybe even her disdain for being pigeonholed that way. Being referred to as a feminist was kind of reductive for Lessing, because she saw herself as just so much more than that. And given what I've read of Lessing in the month or so since I finished this book, I totally get where she's coming from. In her patented, uncompromising manner, she understood that she was more complex, that women in general are a lot more complex than one statement or one single stance or position. Lessing's work jumps between realism and science fiction and parable and memoir and even a little fantasy. In speaking to the New York Times in the 1980s, Lessing said that feminists wanted her to say that she stood side by side in their struggle toward the golden dawn, where all those beastly men were no more. And her response was, do they really want people to make oversimplified statements about men and women? In fact, they do. I've come with great regret to this conclusion. After reading the Golden Notebook and learning a little bit about Lessing herself, I can't help but wonder what she would have done with the current climate that we're living in right now, where men are being, on the one hand, very rightly exposed and punished for their crimes, but on the other hand, almost unilaterally punished as a group. I'm not going to get into the politics of what's going on right now. This certainly isn't the right space to do it, and I'm not nearly intelligent enough to kind of put myself into that conversation. But I just can't help think that Lessing's passing in 2013 was just like a huge loss for that conversation that's happening right now. All that being said, the Golden Notebook is far from perfect. It's almost certainly too long. It stretches a couple of its ideas a bit too thin, I think. It wasn't quite the structural masterpiece that I was really hoping for when I started reading this book, because ultimately what kind of turned me on to the Golden Notebook and made me want to read it as one of the first books that I did in this project was the really interesting narrative structure that it has. Not that it's not interesting while you're reading it, but it's certainly not the hook that I really thought it was going to be. And definitely most egregiously, this book seems kind of homophobic. Lessing's continued insistence on the lack of real men in the world is kind of alarming at a certain point. Just as an example, she describes England as a country full of men who are little boys and homosexuals and half homosexuals. She often walks this really strange line of expecting the men around her to have very traditional male values, but at the same time urging them to modernize with more feminine values, but not too much, because then if you do that, then you're too sensitive and you're too weak and you're gay, apparently. There's a couple times in the book where it feels uncomfortable with how of its time it was. Yeah, so that part of it was pretty disappointing. But anachronisms aside, The Golden Notebook is, I think, as important a book as I've read in a really long time. With all this stuff going on, it actually still manages to be entertaining, especially with the free women narrative, which is by far the best part of the book. I loved that section of the book. But it's not a light and breezy read. If you're going to tackle this book, be prepared to dig in. It demands your attention, but I hope that I've communicated for you today that it is totally worth it. So there you have it, folks. That is The Golden Notebook by Doris Lessing. If you want to know more about my top 125 books project, you can find more info in the description down below. As for my next video in this series, that will be Emma by Jane Austen, which hopefully will be coming out fairly soon because I've already read the book. If you've read The Golden Notebook before, if you've read any Doris Lessing before, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear about it. If you haven't, let me know what your favorite feminist classic is. I have a feeling there will be some wildly divergent answers, which is always fun. As always, thanks for watching, you guys. I know this one was really long, and if you've made it this far, I owe you one. I'm serious about that. Comment below with the longest video that you've ever made. I promise that I will watch it, and I will comment on it. But until next time, guys, enjoy what you're reading, and we'll see you in a little bit.